Welcome and thank you, those of you who've joined in early. We'll give everyone a few more minutes and then we'll get started at 11, give people a chance to get connected. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Matt Smith, Solutions Architect here at Softworks, and I'll be walking us through how conditional access in Azure AD is used in our Zero Trust model. A couple of things before we get started. First, this event is being recorded and will be available to watch again. Second, as we go along, please pop your questions in the Q&A panel and I'll do my best to answer them. So today we're going to look at the principles of Zero Trust and how we prepare for conditional access, then walk through some examples. We'll also look at how Cloud App Security ties into conditional access and that whole Zero Trust model. I'll put, as I say, put some questions into the Q&A and we'll try and maybe answer them as we go along, or if not, then I'll answer them towards the end of the session. So let's start with the typical scenario that we have today. Users of our systems are everywhere. They include employees, partners, contractors, and many of them with their own devices. We're storing sensitive data in cloud services and often share users and apps and data with external parties. So to apply a zero trust approach, we need a way to control and manage all of this. First thing to say is a zero trust approach needs to be an end-to-end strategy that extends throughout the entire digital estate. These are the core elements that we're dealing with, and I'll put a little context around each of them. So identities represent the people. When an identity attempts to access a resource, we need to verify that identity with strong authentication, ensure access is compliant and typical for that identity, and follows a least privileged access principle. Our devices are everything from PCs to smartphones, including bring your own device and partner managed devices, as well as our on-premise servers and even cloud hosted virtual machines. This diversity of devices creates a massive attack surface, which requires us to be able to monitor and enforce compliance across all of them. Now, our applications, including APIs, provide the interface by which data is accessed. So these could be servers or SaaS applications. And we need controls in place to ensure appropriate per app permissions. And we need to validate access based on analysis and at the same time monitor for abnormal behavior and validate that the app itself has a secure configuration to it. Now, by infrastructure, I mean the servers and cloud VMs or containers, maybe microservices that support those applications. We need to be validating versions and the configuration of these resources, these services, and use telemetry to detect attacks or anomalies, and ultimately to be able to automatically block or at the very least flag risky behavior so we can take preventative action. Now, all data is ultimately accessed over networks. We need to provide controls that enhance visibility and prevent attackers from moving laterally across the network. Segmentation and real-time protection, as well as end-to-end encryption, along with monitoring and analytics, are all the tools that we use in this area. Now, ultimately, the whole point of all of this is to be focused on protecting the data. Now, where possible, data should remain safe even when it leaves the devices, apps, and infrastructure that we control. Data should always be classified, labeled, and encrypted with access based on those attributes. Now, each of these 6 foundational elements serves as a source of the signal that we're going to use in our zero trust approach. So in the Microsoft model, we take these signals to enforce controls in real time. The conditional access is the function in Azure AD that contains these policy rules and receives the signals that we're evaluating to achieve our zero trust approach. Now I'm going to dive into the Azure portal and start to take you through how this looks and how some of it works. So bear with me a second while I switch screens. Okay, so here we are in the Azure Active Directory management portal. Now, I want to start by just going through some of those 6 foundational elements that we talked about there. So identity is our users, effectively. I'm sure quite a few of you are used to managing users through Azure AD. For those of you who have not worked with the Azure AD console before, these are the same users that you'd be looking at in maybe the Office 365 Admin Center. The piece that I want to identify here and just make sure we're clear is these are users that are either created purely in Azure AD or they may have come from a synchronization with your on-premise Active Directory. We have user groups as well for permissions management or group-based permissions management, as you'd expect. What I want to highlight here, because we talked a bit about federation or that idea that users come from partners or vendors or external places, these are all part of our guest user that are in Azure AD. So guest users come into our system through various different sources. They might be created by your own users, sharing content through the likes of OneDrive or SharePoint, or providing a link instead of the attachment through Microsoft Outlook. All of those processes have the ability to create guest users in our environment. And because we have these user objects available to us in here, we can make assessments against them and pass them through our conditional access set of rules. So users and guest users give us the kind of core of our identities that we're going to work with. Now, we spoke about applications. So how do we have applications that we can work with in conditional access? These are registered in Azure AD as enterprise applications, and you'll find them in here. So everything that you do that's through Office 365 is automatically an enterprise application in here, along with a whole raft of other services that are kind of pre-populated or already connected to your Azure AD environment. You can come into here even if you've only got an Office 365 basic tenant and have a look and see what's connected. You'll also find that a lot of your users may have automatically or been allowed to connect or register applications in your Azure AD already. So if you've never been into here, it's definitely worth coming in to have a look and see what is attached to your Azure AD, because you may want to then leverage those or use those to control the data that exists in those systems and services. If, for example, you're using something like a Salesforce application or Dropbox or something that's not part of Office 365, then you'll definitely want to register that application and add it to Azure AD in order to be able to use it to enforce this zero trust approach to users accessing that service and the data that resides within it. Point to note here, if you've never come into this area, look at the user settings area in enterprise applications. In here, you've got some very basic controls that are well worth enabling, if your license permits it, that is, so that you can control users automatically adding services into your environment. It's very easy and generally set out of the box, so that a user can go to the likes of Adobe and just tick the yes, I want to join my Office 365 account to Adobe, and then use a single sign-on, and they can implement that themselves. You might want to enforce some controls and have a request and approval process around that. So come into here and into user settings and have a look and see what's defined at the moment for your organization and make the appropriate decisions there. To add applications or to link services into enterprise apps and Azure AD, you've got the new application function in here, and there's a whole raft of kind of curated services that Microsoft have put together for you. So to join things in, if you're a user of SAP or Salesforce, there's many of these pre-done for you, and it's all wizard driven, so it will take you through the process of connecting that, so you get a single sign-on experience, and then you can start to use that application within our conditional access rules. If it's not set here, a lot of vendors will give you instruction on how to complete the configuration on their side, but you can create your own application links or federated applications in Azure AD. You just need to know a few basic settings that vendor will typically supply for you. So I'm not going to take you through the whole exercise of joining applications into Azure AD. That's a kind of topic in its own right, but suffice to say that's how we have applications or specifically SaaS-based applications connected to Azure AD to be able to pass through conditional access. Now, what about those systems that run on our own servers in our own buildings, or maybe even an Azure virtual machine? If those services or those applications are able to connect for federation, like a SAML-based authentication, or maybe they're not and they're just done through like an IIS web server or any kind of web service for that matter, we have this function in Azure AD called the application proxy. And the purpose of this is to place an agent somewhere on the inside of the network, and then use that to proxy connections back in to your environment. And what that will do is use the server that you've nominated as the application proxy, and you might have many of those, to associate with your own custom enterprise application that you have created. And then you'll have a new DNS name to point your users to. They'll go to that connection, you'll probably alias that in DNS, in your public DNS zone. The users will go to that, and then that will pass them to Azure AD, will go through the conditional access rules, apply the zero trust approach to it, and then pass the traffic down to that application proxy agent that will then relay it on to the server inside your building. So it's like a reverse proxy or an inbound web proxy, but we're gaining that ability to apply conditional access rules to it, which we'll get a bit more into as we go along. Now, I want to just cover one topic here quickly around cloud app security, because it's relevant to the application piece in our zero trust model. Now, cloud app security gives us this ability to discover the apps that our users are accessing. So it can do it in a number of different ways, but essentially what we have is services that users have authenticated to by using their Azure AD credentials, or if we've tied the discovery service in through either the monitoring agent for Azure services, or if we've tied it in through something like Defender for Endpoint, then the system can be discovering every app and service that the users have connected to. I just want to highlight that at this point. It's a way for you to go and discover where there's a shadow IT kind of situation going on, users that have found it difficult to share files with a certain customer, so they've gone out of their own accord and started using something like Box or Dropbox, and you hadn't intended for that to be the case, and you maybe are not aware that your data is being placed in that service. Now, hopefully you've got web proxies and content controllers in place that are preventing that scenario, or at least checking for it and alerting you. But if not, this is another way that you can go and get that visibility. The reason, again, that I highlight cloud app security just at this point is we're going to come back to it again in the conditional access rules piece that we'll cover in just a moment. So back to Azure Active Directory. One of the other 6 pillars was devices. Now, devices come to us for processing in this conditional access scenario, largely through one of 2 methods. They are either Azure AD registered, so that can be any device that has authenticated using Azure AD credentials. So it will cover everything from our on-premise systems, potentially all of our servers from Active Directory will be included in that if we've configured that, but also any personal bring your own device type systems, and it gives us that ability to identify that they are not our managed device and control them appropriately. The other way is that systems can be identified through the Endpoint Manager, or used to be referred to as Intune. So I'll touch very briefly, because there's a whole topic on a previous session that we covered around Endpoint Manager. But when devices are enrolled for management and they're available to us here in Endpoint Manager, we gain this ability to do an assessment against them to check to see if they are compliant with our company's needs. So without Endpoint Manager, we're not gaining that ability to assess for compliance. And I'm not going to go any further than that in this particular session, other than to say in the Azure Active Directory Conditional Access, we can use or leverage that is compliant capability, and I'll show you that shortly. But to get that to that point where you are assessing a device for specific criteria, things like has the right antivirus on it, has firewalls enabled, has the right level of encryption, that's all handled by Endpoint Manager, and Endpoint Manager is your area for devices, fixed devices, your property, or devices that have been enrolled with the organization, and that feeds back the compliance status. So the 2 models for managing devices or for having visibility of devices are either a device that has been used to authenticate, so that's just Azure AD registered. We don't get any visibility of its compliance because it's not our device to manage, but we know it's a device that somebody is using, so we can make decisions on the basis that it's not managed by us and we don't know that it's secure. The other model is that they've come through Endpoint Manager, and we can then perform assessments against them and know how suitable that device is in order to be able to access the service or the data that we're going to pass to it. So that's where devices live. And as far as Azure Active Directory is concerned, they're all in this one container area. They just might be a sort of slightly different status of either not ours, not managed, or through the Intune Endpoint Manager service, in which case we get to see this status of whether or not it's compliant. So from there, those are the two kind of key areas that we're going to start with in conditional access. Let's have a look at how we actually configure conditional access services, and let's put some of those ideas into practice, and I'll take you through some scenarios. So conditional access can be found under the security section of Azure Active Directory. You will also find it through Endpoint Manager under the Endpoint Security service. It's just a link to the same place. It's all one in the same thing, and conditional access is a function of Azure AD. It's just visible and available to you through the Endpoint Manager console. So here in conditional access, when we go to start creating rules, the first thing I'll say to everybody is a trial and error approach here will get you into probably quite a pickle quite quickly. So you want to start by sitting down and assessing how do my users work? What are all the working scenarios? My recommendation to you would be to take an approach of think about each operating system type and then each kind of team or working group of users and the applications and services that they're going to access, because it will help you think along the lines of should that team be working from their own personal devices or only our company owned and managed devices, and it'll also help you think about how do I need to police or control the access to specific applications. So you want to get those groupings together, and it's always useful, I find, to write yourself a definition in kind of plain English before you sit down and try and create these policies. But let's take you through a couple of basic kind of policy scenarios. So the simplest one that we'll do an example of here is just to apply an MFA control. So when we're going to configure a conditional access policy, we always start by specifying who we're going to target this at. Now, it may be all users, but I would actively encourage to start with that you always begin with a pilot group whenever you're configuring any services, so that you can test this out and run the appropriate kind of checks and exercises against those particular accounts. So we specified some users that we're going to apply this to. A tip here around the applications that we're going to apply these to is I would be very cautious around using the all cloud apps control. The reason for that is that you will catch many processes in that you probably didn't intend to. A good example of this is if you're working with Endpoint Manager and you're trying to implement something like the autopilot process, or you want the machines to do a kind of pre-deployment of applications. In a lot of those instances, forcing things like MFA or compliance checks on all cloud apps will catch services like the Microsoft Store, They might catch things like the Apple Business Manager service or access to iCloud. So you may cause yourself more of a problem there, in that the systems may not be able to download the applications and the plugins and the services that they need, because they won't have reached that point of being compliant in Endpoint Manager. So a tip from me, and this would be Softworks' recommendation, is your starting point generally for applying controls is to use this Office 365 control if you're an Office 365 user, and to ensure that you're protecting the Azure environment as well. You'll find an object in here called the Azure Management Service, so the Microsoft Azure Management application. By adding those two and then looking to see other critical areas where you know you've stored data, so I'll give an example for Softworks here. We have a Mimecast service, and adding those in, start with those two, Office 365 and your Azure Management, and then add in the other functions or systems and services that you know you want to protect. That's a far more sensible and safer approach for building out conditional access policies. So once we've specified the applications that we're going to target, we now know that when these specific users try and log on to these specific services, what we're going to be able to apply some logic to what we want to check for. And before we do that, we also want to identify what type of device they're coming from. So this goes back to my suggestion that you should start with a written definition of how you think all your users should work, validate that with the business unit managers to make sure that you've covered every scenario you think you've got before you begin. Then you start your pilot process to test these controls. So some key important areas to look at here when we talk about conditions. So this is all about assignment. So this is what we're looking for to determine that the rules that we're going to come to in a minute are going to be applied. So in this MFA area, I'm going to say I don't mind what the user risk level is here, because I know that I want to apply MFA to every scenario except where I know a user's device is compliant. So we're going to go with that model here. So we're going to say if they try and connect to us from any device other than those that are managed by me and have met my compliance checks, I'm going to force them to use MFA. So in this scenario, I'm not going to apply a user risk. But what I might do is say, if a user risk, so I've seen an anomaly in their logon behavior, comes back as a medium or high risk, I might immediately force them through MFA, and that will then apply until their user risk comes back down. So if it's a one-off event and their risk is flagged as high, it would probably be flagged as medium in a one-off event, but if they then log in through MFA and the pattern for them logging in settles down, their risk might return back to low, and then they won't be forced to use MFA again. Equally, you might set your risk rules up to say prompt an administrator who has to go in and check it and then clear their status when they're happy. But this is a way you can catch it immediately to say risk has been flagged above normal. I want to immediately ensure MFA so that that's in place until I, as an administrator, can get there to do something about it. For the sign-in risk, this is much more frequent. So Azure Active Directory assigns either a user risk, so potentially there's a problem with that account that's been seen over time, or it applies a sign-in risk, which is that the event's happening right now, so this individual sign-in event has a risk against it. So there's two different scores being set, and you can use those in exactly the same way by triggering it to apply whatever the control is we're going to set. In this example, MFA. Now, device platforms is very important. You'll typically have different scenarios for PCs than you will for your iOS or Android devices and your mobiles. So a recommendation here would be make sure you've got a policy that covers any device, Otherwise, if they don't hit a match, so a Linux system, for example, then they might circumvent the access policy. So in my MFA model here, I'm going to say any device except iOS and Android, because I'm going to apply a different MFA rule to those users. And that should catch anything that looks like a PC or a server. Now for locations, take that example on the servers, I may not want MFA to apply to the servers because I trust those explicitly. So I'm going to say from this particular server, I'm not going to impose this additional MFA check. I've seen people as well use that sort of scenario to not require MFA if all their employees are in the building. Again, little suggestion would be try and stick to not requiring MFA if the device is compliant. You know, trust the individual device, trusting the building. It's not that difficult to spoof an IP. You're only talking about public IPs, and what else egress is the network in that building. Guest Wi-Fi. Could somebody have got on the Wi-Fi sitting in the car park? There's many scenarios there where trusting a whole building isn't necessarily a particularly good idea. But in certain circumstances, trusting a particular server or a particular single IP address with a single function is appropriate and relevant. Now, the apps or the client apps, what we're talking about here is identifying how the user is trying to connect to the service. So in this scenario, I'm going to apply the MFA to everything that's being tried, so every possible method that we can look for. But you could take an example there where this account may need to connect to Exchange with SMTP, and the SMTP client may not be able to perform MFA. So we'd need to catch that with a different rule and apply some different controls. That would probably look something like allowing other client types to connect, but only from specific IPs. That way we know that they're only authenticating to the SMTP service using the client that can't do MFA because it's an app on a server, or maybe the IIS service is logging in order to act as a smart host and forward messages. So we choose the way the users are trying to connect and apply those. And then in my example, I said I was not going to apply this to devices that are compliant. So whenever a device falls outside of compliance, a user is trying to connect with a machine that I don't manage, I want this rule to apply. And I achieve that by looking at the device state in my conditions and seeing if it's marked as compliant and excluding it from this particular rule. Now, some of that might seem a bit counter-intuitive, but it's important to understand that you do have to look at all of these assignments from an include and exclude point of view, and you'll often find yourself building rules that apply controls by locking everything down unless it's excluded. So just bear that in mind when you come to create them. And then the grant control that we apply tells the system what criteria they must meet in order for that action or for that logon, that authentication attempt to succeed. So in this scenario, we would say we'd require them to use multi-factor authentication, and then that will ensure in this model that when this particular person tries to access any of these Mimecast or Office 365 services, and they're coming from a PC device, and that PC device is from our server, so when they're connecting from our server using either a browser or a client application, and their device is not compliant, then they must use MFA. So it's just one example around MFA, but I wanted to give you a little walkthrough of how we build these conditional access rules. Now, I'm going to just try and explain how that then gets put together and why in this example environment I have a whole list of conditional access rules. When you come to design these rules, they are all compound rules. So it's all these rules added together, looking at their includes and their excludes every time any identity that's attached to Azure Active Directory tries the apps that are connected, or the services that are connected to the rules. So every time an identity tries to touch Azure AD, we process all of these rules together. So you're going to always end up with more than one of these rules to put together. And what I wanted to get across today was why it's so important to ensure that you sit down at the beginning, think through how you want your users to be accessing services, what services are involved, get that clear understanding of how they should be using each type of device. Start by thinking about it from the point of view of what's the operating system on that device. Is it Android? Is it iOS? Is it Windows? Is it Mac? Is it something else? And when they try and connect to you, which applications are they using, and how do you want to apply your controls? So if you know that they should only be ever connecting you from your managed Android devices, then you want to make sure that your rule set has been built so that it's not possible for an Android device to authenticate through any means unless it is marked as compliant. Now we're rapidly burning through time here, so I want to cover an area that most people miss or haven't explored properly yet in conditional access, and that is around the use of session-based controls. So session controls in Azure Active Directory conditional access provide us with some really quite enhanced kind of protections around what users are doing with our data. So a session-based control applies every time the authentication event occurs. It's now looking at what's happening at the point they log on, as opposed to focusing on what they need to do or how their device needs to be configured in order for them to actually perform the authentication. So you often build session controls as well as grant controls. Again, I would advise not to try and mix them in the same rules. You would want to try and keep your session controls separate so you can see in your event logs what's going on when the users try and sign in. So a common one is just the sign in frequency. So instead of the users always being able to tick the box that says sign me in forever, and then they've done their MFA check once and you never see it again, this session frequency control allows you to set a number of hours or a number of days. And if you think back to that assignment, particular groups of users, so you might have all my guest user accounts must sign in every day. So we won't make them do it every time they change browser tabs, but we want to know it's definitely them because they're external parties and they're guests, and they're definitely working on devices that we don't have control over. So we want to make sure that they can't leave the system signed in by mistake. So that might be limited to 1 day or maybe 2, 3, 4 hours. You'd have to decide that based on what they're doing, what you expect their activity to be, and it's all about making it as easy for the user as possible, but without making it overly kind of restrictive, but at the same time still achieving sufficient security for what the organization needs. The bit that I really want to focus here in the session controls is this conditional access app control. Now you'll see this in a great number of subscriptions. Business Premium has this capability in it. Different levels of service are available in different plans, but I want to make you aware of how this works. So using a conditional access app control to block downloads is a very simple way to apply a granular control to something like OneDrive or SharePoint, or it might be your Salesforce app or any service for that matter, where you want to ensure that when a specific user group logs on, and let's say their device is not compliant, so we'd use that conditions control that we had in here to look at the device state, and we'd make sure that we were not excluding compliant devices on here. We could then look at a session control that uses a conditional access app for, say, a web session to block downloads. So that would enable you to create a scenario where your users on your compliant devices, because you could exclude the compliant device, they can download because it's your device and you trust it. The same user trying to access from a non-compliant device, so something that you don't manage, would have the download blocked. And that gives you the ability to let them in through a web browser on a personal PC, but stop your data from wandering off onto that PC because they can't click the download button. What they'll get is a text file that downloads that says you're not allowed to download this content. So it's again like an inbound proxy, effectively, is what Conditional Access App Control is doing in that scenario. The other area to look at, and this is in some of the more advanced subscription plans, is to use the custom policy service. And what that's telling Conditional Access to do is to take the scenario, these users from these apps, or making this connection type, or from this device type, send that particular event over to the Cloud App Security service for policy processing. And then back here in Cloud App Security, where I showed you before, what we have in here is a set of apps and services that have been connected to our environment. And this doesn't just focus on Exchange and SharePoint, but those are pre-configured for you, so you can do those. But we can take any other service that we have connected, like say Salesforce or Dropbox as an example. And when that service is used, or those users connect to it, we can create policies around that particular application access. So we might have a session policy is the type that we'll be looking at, and in that particular session policy, we can say if they match this criteria. So we could say a cut, copy and paste exercise through the browser. So if their activity is cut, copy or paste, and they're not one of our managed devices, then we can choose to block that particular action and maybe notify some auditors and build a whole set of rules in here that apply to these applications. So from a Azure Active Directory conditional access point of view, what we're doing is using conditional access to say these people from these devices in this scenario must go to Cloud App Security in order to process further controls. That's the use custom policy function. And then in Cloud App Security, it's about creating policies, typically DLP type policies, that prevent a further action. You might also in these policies create like a file control policy. So allow them to perform the particular download, but when they perform that download, you might want to apply a classification control to them that then forces that to be encrypted so that only users within the organization can read the file. And that's how you would build a control that allows users to continue to work. They can use it in the web, they can access on the web browser service, but as soon as they try to download onto a PC that you don't manage, in that example, the file will be encrypted on the fly, and then they can only ever open that again if they authenticate and log in, because in that scenario, they're an employee. So I know we've covered quite a lot there, and I'm conscious of the time. We're coming up to our kind of 45 minutes for this particular session. It's really to give you an idea of where you should be looking and how you should begin when you want to think about putting together conditional access rules, start with that idea of how do all your users work. Write yourself that document, give yourself those definitions. What apps am I using? What device types am I using? What services are they connecting to? How should each different type of user or each different group of user be accessing those services? And then from there, you can use that to start to design your conditional access rules. And just always remember that in conditional access rules, they are all compound. So everything you create is added together. And they're always applied, so you leverage your includes and your excludes in each rule in order to make sure that they are applied correctly at the point the user logs on. Okay, let's switch back over and just start to wrap up the session here, and we'll just have a little look in the Q&A and see if we've got any questions from anybody in the audience as we went along there. So I can see my colleague Faith, who's helping us here, and we've got a couple of questions. So from Obi, I think, can conditional access policies also be applied to external users from downloading files on a SharePoint site? So hopefully that final example there of using that conditional access rule where we target through a session control, and the session control applies that cloud app access type, then through that, yes, you can. So your rule would be pretty simple. In your assigned users and groups, you would be targeting guests and external users. You'd need to decide what device types you want to apply that to. In your cloud apps or actions, you would target either the whole of Office 365 or, for your example, just SharePoint, but I would suggest probably target the whole of Office 365. And then in your session control, you wouldn't need a grant control for this, but in your session control, you would set the use conditional access policy, and because in your model you just want to prevent users downloading, you'd simply choose the really easy block downloads option against it. I might want to suggest there that you probably should put them through MFA, even though they're guests. You kind of want to make sure they are definitely who they say they are, and that's how you'd build that particular rule. We've got another question here. We switched on cloud app based conditional access for our organization, preventing file downloads on unmanaged machines. It was great except for PDFs. The preview of those on Chrome or Edge got blocked. They work on Firefox. Do we know a specific way around this for PDF previews? I have to be honest, I've not personally come across that particular scenario, but if you want to reach out and get in touch, my contact details are on the screen at the moment. We'll certainly pass that through our technical team and make sure that we get you an answer for that particular scenario. I'm sure it's been tested somewhere from one of our team previously. Okay, I can't see, I might have one more new question. No problem, Obi, I'm glad that was of use for you. So I can't see any further questions there. We've kind of reached our time limit here on the session today. So I just want to say thank you very much to everybody for attending and watching. Do please use my email address, call through to the main number, they can get hold of me. If you've got specific questions, feel free to fire them over. I will make sure they all get answered. And if you want to have a look in a bit more detail or walk through a session yourselves and look at your particular scenario, then get in touch. I can make arrangements through our sales team. They have or they can book you an initial consult for up to an hour. We always offer an hour for free for any new clients that are joining us. Obviously, any existing customers that are with us on the call today, then get in touch with your account manager. If you want to see any more of this in any more detail, they can book my time, or if you've got a consultant that you work with regularly at Softworks, time with that consultant, and we'll go through that same initial consult exercise to help you decide and define how you might want to use this service. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. We'll wrap the session up there, and like I say, it's recorded and will be available to watch again very shortly. Thanks very much for your time.